Okay, well, one thing that I'm noticing here is I'm looking at this at my syllabus and kind of looking at some notes I have about what I want to say about these chapters is that they're really out of order. I for some reason I have the discussion about assessments, which comes before planning and contracting for change. I have that set up for 2 weeks from now. Don't ask me why, but that's kind of how it wound up. There was obviously there had to have been some logic that I was following at the time that I did this, but I'm not sure what it was at the time being. So forgive me for this. It may be out of order, but I think it will still be comprehensible for you and uh, I think useful to you. These two chapters, I think, really the workbooks, chapter 11 and Hepworth, chapter 12, really do go together. They talk about much the same thing, the same process. They use some different terms, but you're going to see a parallel in some of their in their terms and what they're talking about. I'm going to touch on that some, but they do also have their own perspective on this process that I think is useful for you, and that's again one of the things. There are many things in this course where the textbooks kind of echo each other, but it isn't exactly saying precisely the same thing, and so you get different angles on these topics, and I think it's useful for us to see them from different angles. And I don't know about you, but for myself, sometimes one particular way of portraying a topic or covering a topic doesn't fit so much with me, whereas another one might work a little better for me. So hopefully, at least you'll find something to connect with here in this topic of planning and contracting for change. But it really is the step that follows the exploration and assessment process that we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks. And it hopefully ends in the development of a service agreement, a contract, so to speak. It depends on what agency you're working for, what you wind up calling this, but let's just call it a contract or a service agreement for the time being. That is a contract for change between the worker and the client. Now, sometimes the particular, well, we'll get to that in a second. The particular way, the particular shape that this agreement turns out depends a lot upon the agency that you're employed with. But there is a civil behavior contract late in this presentation, which frankly I like a lot, but is something that well, working for OCS, I had trouble getting uh, approval to even put these things to use. In fact, we were told to stop using them when we started using them kind of on our own in Kenai in our intake section for a while. But that's another story. I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go along here. So again, this whole process starts in the exploration and assessment phase and really continues, throughout this whole throughout the first several meetings, let's say you have with the client. Um, Frequently, um, one thing that's I think is very important to keep in mind is that as as work goes forward, it isn't a sort of a steady progression of change and improvement and cooperation and client motivation and all of those kinds of things. If you're thinking about a bar graph, it isn't a steady line that goes straight up, to the right like graphs will do. Instead, what it is it's one of those things where you see a spiral. Perhaps change, things improve for a while, and then it drops back, and then it picks up again and improves, and then drops back again and picks up again and drops back, and goes on and on and on, this spiral that hopefully as the change, say, regresses, that point of regression is higher than the last point of regression, and and successively continues to do that. So this is kind of the way change occurs. It's one step forward, two steps back, or two steps forward, one step back. Hopefully, more so. It isn't change doesn't happen in a steady progression where you can count on things to always be getting better forever. And so this is where this thing about here where clients will sometimes lapse in their attempts to change. They will sometimes have to go back and redo previous stages and kind of recycle through that process before the change becomes habituated. So that's just something to keep in mind. Don't be discouraged if you see some steps backwards or regression, because that's really a part of of the process for your client. In substance abuse treatment, oftentimes, for instance, during periods of sobriety, the recovering addict will have a relapse. And this is an example of that. And people that work in the substance abuse field will tell you that relapses are part of recovery, and so that's just an example of this, that change comes about in fits and start. Cournoyer has a kind of a snappy little five P's for the process of contracting. The psych, prep, perspire, persevere, and persist. And there are going to be different ways of looking at this process. But first, we identify goals, get ready to take action, and then we develop plans to facilitate the achievement of the goals and put that plan into action itself. And as those slips and lapses and relapses occur, or the plateaus come about in the change process, we deal with that. We concentrate on what are the obstacles and what are fueling the obstacles, and maybe we have to leave the original goal, let's say, and step aside of that and deal with the obstacle and find ways to overcome that before we can get back to working on that goal again with the client. But this is the thing that, this again is a part of that process of persevering. And then finally, finding a way to maintain the desired change over a sustained period of time. It's a reality that, your client is not going to be with you forever, certainly, and maybe not for a very long time even. And so we want to be able to prepare our clients for that, and to begin to develop some ways that the clients can maintain the changes as they leave our work together. Goals, they're central to achieving the outcomes and working in a systematic and process oriented approach. So the goal is the thing that defines the process of reaching that final destination point, that thing you're working towards. Now, there are different terms used and different levels, let's say, of goals. And I wanted to have the format that an agency is using. One of my contacts with the Office of Children's Services is going to provide this, but I don't have it today. But um, I, I will have that probably for you when we have our next collaborate meeting. But just to show you the way the agencies go about actually putting some of this into practice. So that when we talk about goals, um, we may be talking about various levels of goals. So that there may be bigger treatment objectives, let's say, or intervention objectives, and then within those objectives are more specific goals, things that we want to achieve that will lead us towards accomplishing that objective. And within the goal, there is going to be action steps or specific tasks that will have to be taken by the client, probably by you as well. So that there's various levels of specificity, let's say, in terms of setting these things up. But when we agree upon goals, when we agree upon our objectives, we're really, uh, ensuring agreement between the worker and the client, that we really know what we're talking about, that we're working and focusing upon the same thing, so that we don't find ourselves working at cross purposes. And these strategies or these action steps, kind of operationalize what the goal is. This is what we want to do. This is what we want to accomplish. So what do we have? What does the client have to do? What does the worker have to do specifically that will enable the client to reach that particular goal? That's what we call operationalizing, and that involves strategies and tasks and those kinds of things. The more specific the concern is, the more specific the goal is, let's say, the clearer the tasks become. And the nice thing about these smaller smaller units, let's say, in the goal, these specific tasks and strategies, is that it breaks up this big problem into smaller pieces, and it's what we call partializing the problem, so that when we partialize the problem, what may seem to be an unattainable goal for the client, an unattainable change to be made, that maybe the client has no idea how they'll ever get there. If you're doing good work with that person, you're going to be able to break this down into manageable steps, so that success is achieved little by little, and ever moving closer and closer to that goal. So there's lots of things that, of course, that are going to influence the kind of goals you develop, and these are things like how active is the client in participating, whether or not the client is voluntary or involuntary is going to really be a major influence upon that. Involuntary clients, a lot of times you may have to work towards engaging them in the process with you. Involuntary clients, adolescents being dragged into treatment by their parents, or abusive spouses, for instance, who needs to get into treatment, and sometimes you have to be careful about those kinds of things. Somebody's on probation, and is sent to you for to work on specific tasks and things related to their law violations, those kinds of things. So those individuals sometimes will come to you and don't particularly want to be there, and this is where you use your creativity to find ways to, first of all, to identify some things that involuntary client can invest in, so that they become more of a voluntary client, and in the process maybe achieve their goals. Values and beliefs, both your client's values and beliefs and your own, have something to do with goal development. We're going to talk about that in a few moments, and what kind of resources and supports are around those kinds of things. A big thing to consider also is, we may have touched on this earlier, that when a client changes, when an individual changes, the people in that person's environment, the other family members or the co-workers, or whoever it might be, those individuals are going to have to make some adjustments as well, almost always. And what you find sometimes, if the client's not making progress in goals, it may be that he or she is not getting the support they need from the significant others, or the others in that person's life. There may be things, actually some active intervention or active steps being taken to undermine that progress. And so there's just some things. These are all different kinds of things that influence goal development, and also progress on goals. So yes, we want to consider the client's ability to and their willingness to work towards the goals. Goals need to be able to be related to the desired results that voluntary clients have, and for involuntary clients, we want to look for something called motivational congruence, which really is, where the involuntary client is actually willing to work and is motivated to work with you. Again, sometimes you have to find some unique ways to do that, but it can be done. If you have a client who hasn't really come to terms with the issues identified, you may want to postpone goal specification. Now, an example of this, in the outpatient mental health center where we worked, we were working with adult and adolescent juvenile sex offenders, and some of the adult sex offenders were sent over to probation. There was one individual that was working there who kind of established herself as an expert in working with sex offenders. I'm not really sure that expertise was quite as strong as she presented, but nonetheless, we found that adult probation was referring a lot of their sex offenders, outpatient people, to her for treatment, and when they would be released from jail, for instance, they needed to follow up with community-based treatment, and her kind of rule of thumb is that she would give them 2 or 3 sessions to acknowledge their offense, and to agree to work on a case plan together. And if you know anything about sex offenders, you know that being able to acknowledge their offense even after a time in jail, is is a huge task for them, and it's not something that they can do quickly. And so it's basically what she was doing was assuring that because she would report to the probation officer that the clients weren't cooperating, and they'd violate their probation and send them back to prison, And so we had to find a different way to kind of work with that problem because it became clear to probation that we weren't really helping their clients at all. And there were some, got a few other people involved, myself included, and a few other people, to find some different ways to approach that topic. But again, it really has something to do with, does the client acknowledge, there is even an issue, a problem, and if not, how do you deal with that? And there are very specific ways. Again, that is, depending upon the situation, you find ways to develop goals that motivate them. Uh, Stage matching is a big factor here. That's something like we were talking about motivational interviewing a week or so back, and this is about this. Are they at a stage right now where they acknowledge the change? Are they interested in working on it or not? Are they motivated to change? Those kinds of things. And so you don't want to try to push a client into agreement things before they're really even ready to acknowledge that there's a problem. Um, this is Cournoyer's little way of remembering how to construct goals with clients, the process of that, or what are important in that. The SMART format, which means the goals should be specific. It's a good thing. The more specific it is, the more everybody knows what has to be done. Measurable, so that you can see progress or lack thereof. Action oriented, so that there's always something for people to get to kind of get their teeth into and to really work on. Be realistic and timely. Smart. So the goals really need to relate to the desired results of voluntary clients, and this is, we were talking about this earlier. Motivational congruence and an agreeable mandate, striking a deal, getting rid of the mandate. All these kinds of things are ways to develop. The motivation of involuntary clients. Sometimes the thing is, you don't want to be here in treatment with us, and I understand that. So, but your probation officer says, or your mom and dad say, that you need to do X, Y, and Z. You don't agree with that, but if we can at least agree upon the fact that you would like to, to be able to accomplish enough in here that you can be excused from this process. How do we do this? What kind of goals are we going to establish so that you can, satisfy your referring agent that you're making progress? Different kind of ways to approach that. So then also you have to look at the agency you're working with as well, because depending upon the type of agency you're working for, there are particular things your client or your agency does do and doesn't do. And so, what are the agency's goals for the client? What are the client's goals and value? And you look for that intersection there, and that intersection of those two in this sort of Venn diagram. Now I put the SMART little anagram down there for you: measurable, specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and timely, to compare to what Hepworth et al. Talk about when it comes to goals, and look at the parallels here. They should be defined in explicit and measurable terms. Well, you've got specific and measurable right there. And I was talking about partializing problems, and so you break these goals into manageable parts that the client can take steps towards achieving. And so that's the action oriented phase. And the goals have to be feasible. They have to be realistic. They have to be something that can be accomplished and is within the range of the capabilities of the client. We a lot of times when I would develop case plans with clients, one of the things that I would do, or I would encourage my workers to do, was to structure in some goals early in the process that was something that the client could achieve reasonably, and experience some success in working with you. That's one way to engage particularly an involuntary client, but any client really is to identify some smaller objectives or steps that that client can achieve and experience some success that you can provide some reward and praise to them for that process. And rather than establishing a big goal that is something they're not going to be able to achieve right away and they feel defeated before they even begin the process. And this we return to in a moment, but you want to make sure that the goals are stated in positive terms that emphasize growth. And I'll give you a couple examples here in a moment. But now another consideration isn't not just what the client wants to do and what the client is willing to accomplish, but also what are you capable as a practitioner of doing as well. So you want to make sure the goals you establish are things that match your knowledge and skills as well. And if you don't have those knowledge and skills, that doesn't mean you have to refer to another person if you've got good supervision or good consultation. But you want to make sure that your client knows that you're consulting with another person in this. You don't want to represent yourself as having skills that you don't have, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't work with people, if you've got the right kind of supervision helping you along the way. And this is one of the ways you grow and you gain skills. But this is just a consideration for us to think. And another thing here is what kinds of goals can you agree to, and which do you maybe have reservations about? And if your client has a goal that you don't think is a good thing for your client to work towards, now we have self-determination to consider, but there may be situations. Let's say you have a 16-year-old client who you know wants to move out. Has got this overpowering drive for independence, which teenagers often have. Has a buddy who has is a couple of years older and has an apartment already and a car, and this 16-year-old has a part-time job and is just sure that he can move out of his parents, and so he wants you to kind of uh, work with him to find a way to convince his parents that it's okay to do this, and you can tell from his skill level and those kinds of things that this is not something that's a wise thing for him, and it's probably not a good situation to be moving into those kinds of things. And so, that may be a goal where you have to tell them you really can't work with them in that respect. And there may be other things, even where you find some of your own values conflicting with the kinds of things the clients want. And in those instances, again, I think it's very important that we be honest with our clients about this, but sometimes we do need to refer to other people. There may be situations where you don't have the capacity to refer to other people, and that becomes more complicated. And we'll be talking about that as the semester goes along. If you're working in a very small community where there's very limited resources, for instance. So when you're writing up goal statements, we want to try to keep it in the positive, like I was saying. And here's some examples of negative statements and as compared to the positive statements that have a more of a motivating kind of a force behind them. Discontinue the frequency of drinking binges, or something like that. Reduce the number of times that the client gets drunk. Instead of writing a goal like that, how about increasing periods of sobriety? Which is a more positive kind of thing to work towards. And so when you do write these goals, try not to get into this kind of thing of restricting and stopping and those kinds of things, and instead, look at developing and encouraging and those kinds of things. So that there's a more positive kind of tinge rather to the goal that you're writing. Again, as we were talking about a little while ago, we want to determine the client's readiness for goal negotiation. Any goal that you do get established, you want to be sure that the client is clear on the purpose and function of goals. Um, Jointly select appropriate goals. You work together on this. It's hopefully not anything that you're imposing on the client. Even if you're working with a client on a mandated level, you can still develop goals together that fit the mandate that you have as far as what you need to accomplish with your client, but might also be something that's more palatable for your client as well. Explicit, specific. Look for potential barriers to goal attainment and discuss the benefits and the risks. Sometimes when you make positive changes, like we've been talking, like I mentioned earlier, other things happen that you don't necessarily find to be all that great, and and so it's important for a client to know this. When I started working in the mental health center, my when I did some couples work for a while with marital therapy, and one of the things that my supervisor told me was always want to make sure that couples understand that there's a risk that individuals may decide they don't want to stay together in marital therapy, and in fact, I think there have been studies that suggest. Now, whether they're randomized controlled studies, I don't know, but studies that have suggested at least that more than 50% of individuals going into marital therapy wind up breaking up after a period of time. And there's different reasons for that. It might be because, they've waited that long to really resolve the issue or whatever, that it's maybe too late, that kind of thing, but in any event, you want to discuss that with your client, what the risks are. You may decide, as you go through therapy, that you don't want to be together. Just know that, and you know, uh, that's just one example of some of the risks and benefits. We also know that I had another supervisor who used to talk about, he's a big family systems person, and he used to talk about the dance that families had together, and so when there was an identified patient in the family, somebody who had a problem that really was kind of acting out a lot of the issues in the family system in general. For instance, an alcoholic generally has their behaviors of the people around that alcoholic that support that alcoholism. And that's a very difficult thing for everybody in the family system to recognize, but that's why the AA organizations often have Al-Anon meetings for the spouses and Alateen meetings for the kids, because they recognize that as the alcoholic changes, as the addict changes, roles and activities and actions and all those kinds of ways that the family fit together, that dance is going to change also and impact everyone else. And that's where a lot of times, you find that family members don't always support positive changes. So these are the kinds of things, again, if you're going to change this behavior, there will be other changes at home that you might find unpleasant, and you may need to be prepared for that and prepare your spouse or your children for this as well. So you want to, after through all that discussion, you're going to be hopefully helping your client reach a point where they're clear about making this commitment to specific goals, and then hopefully you're going to be able to allow the client to rank order those goals to decide which ones are most important and which ones need the most attention or the most immediate attention. Sometimes, again, that's mandated for you. We do work with a lot of involuntary clients in social work. I mean, that's just one of the things that we do in this field, probably more than any other professional field. We have a lot of involuntary clients, and so working with those mandatory clients is a skill. This was Egan's criteria. I believe this is in the Cournoyer textbook, and or the workbook rather. But Egan's criteria for effective goals say that first of all they're stated as accomplishments, and that goes back to the negative and positive ways of wording. Clients don't stop doing something, but rather achieve something when you write the goal. Uh, Clear and specific. You hear that over and over. Measurable and verifiable. Mind you, we have to be able to have some accountability that our work is accomplishing things, and we're going to be evaluating as throughout the process of this work as to whether or not change is occurring, whether our work is being effective or not. What we're doing is really impacting the targeted behavior, and so being able to measure and verify changes is a very important thing in that process. Realistic and time specific. adequate if achieved to improve the situation. Make sure you're working on something that's going to make a difference. That we don't want people wasting their time, nor you wasting your time as well. And another thing, particularly more and more important now, is Anchorage in particular, as we've mentioned, is a very multicultural city, and it's very important in the process of this. And this should come out in your assessment, which is going to be a couple of weeks from now. But this should come out in your assessment about what kind of values the client has, and what if the client belongs to certain cultural groups. How is that going to impact the change process, and will the client's values and culture support the changes that you're seeking as well? So in some agencies, these action plans, this comes from the workbook, but the action plans are called service plans, treatment plans, case plans. There's a number of different service agreements. I've heard, there's a number of different terms for this document that you're putting together. But basically, the action plan to me is the strategies. You know what the goals are. You know what your objectives are. Let's say you've reached that understanding. And it's another thing, by the way. Don't come up with 10 or 12 objectives, even though there may be 10 or 12 things that need attention in your client's life. But start with a couple, maybe three at the most. But if you've got too many objectives, um, you're not going to be able to your client's not going to want to work with you because it's going to be too overwhelming. And so if that's where the rank ordering comes in, I think you begin to you identify the most important things and start there. And probably the others, many of the other kinds of things that need to change of those 10 or 12 things are going to change just in the course of changing the most important things. So limit the number of goals, let's say, that you set for your client, or with your client rather. And then in those action plans, these are going to address those specific steps to accomplish those goals. Who does it? What is done? Where is it done sometimes, and when is it going to be done, and when will it be accomplished? So you'll have a time limitation, so to speak, on these action steps, and so that it's done by such and such a date, and that way you can actually see, is the action actually taken, has it been accomplished or not. And if it hasn't been accomplished, then it's time for a discussion with your client about what's gotten in the way. Were there obstacles, that transportation issues, let's say, or money issues, perhaps, or was somebody who was a key figure in this action wouldn't participate in it, or were there people discouraging the client? Was the client losing motivation? Those kinds of things. So why is it that we haven't made this progress? And so these are things that you that really kind of get answered if you write the kind of plan that's specific enough, and that we can measure it and see what's going on. The worker has to be involved in this. So what roles is the worker going to adopt? And this is something that perhaps uh, you will establish with your client. The more a client is engaged in all of this process, the more invested the client's going to be in change. We don't want to impose goals on clients. We want to engage them in developing goals together. Okay. Well, again, what will be done, when, and by whom? Action steps are known as instrumental objectives. I think this is Cournoyer's term. So, as I was saying earlier, we've got to break these tasks down into smaller, or the goals down into smaller tasks that have a higher probability of success. The smaller the focus, the more specific the focus, the more likely it is things are going to be achievable. And you can see client tasks, those are things that the client has to do in between or outside of your meeting. This refers to a session. Sometimes these textbooks begin to get kind of therapy oriented, and there's so many other environments you're gonna, although your contacts are always therapeutic with clients and has that element to it. It isn't always necessarily a therapy kind of a meeting, but any of it, between session, that's what makes me think that when they refer to sessions. But between meeting tasks, the things the client is doing when you're not around. What are you doing to support that? Are you making phone calls? Are you doing any brokering? Are you checking in with someone, with the client or other people? Those kinds of things. Maybe some in-session tasks. Some role plays, some different kinds of things that the client may do when meeting with you, and what are the kinds of things that the client needs to do. What kind of skills does the client need to develop to maintain that change? Working with sex offenders again, I'm thinking about, and this is much the same model I believe that they use in the substance abuse field. Motivational interviewing and relapse prevention is the model I'm going to talk about. These Most of these seem to originate in substance abuse treatment field, and that tells you a little bit about how challenging that field is, to work with clients, because uh, you know, statistics aren't the greatest in terms of improvement because of interventions in substance abuse. Not as a whole. I mean, the success rates are sometimes pretty abysmal, but there's no doubt there's a big need for treatment, and so this field is always looking for new ways to, I think, to motivate clients and to help them get control of things. And so one of the models that they use is the relapse prevention model, and it has been adapted or adopted and adapted by the sexual abuse, sexual offender treatment uh, field as well. So that you you help with the client to identify high risk situations. Those are the kinds of circumstances where the client might reoffend, and equip that client with a number of different things that client can do, or people that the client can turn to, that will help get them out of that cycle of reoffending. And it is a cycle, and it's a very interesting kind of process working with those individuals. But this is the kind of maintenance task we're talking about here. So we're going to have to, as I mentioned, monitor progress and evaluating how things going. And there's a number of different ways of going about that. Self-administered scales, self-anchored scales. There's, I think, an example here in another slide or two of a self-anchored scale. It are some of the simplest things. Again, uh, the evidence-based practice might question the usefulness of these things, but I think most everybody, and maybe even Gabriel, talks about how these are things that are going to give instant feedback, and are simple enough that you can apply them at the beginning of a meeting, at the end of a meeting, or you can do it from one meeting to the next, or every couple weeks, and you kind of just chart what's going on with the client in these areas. So uh, baseline measures, Gabriel's going to talk about this a lot, and uh, I know that we're reading some of her chapters about behavioral interventions where she gets into observation and observations and taking baselines and things like that. I also believe we're working around some of those chapters, because that's, behavioral interventions is something it really deserves not only a single class but a series of classes really to do well, and it just isn't feasible to teach too many behavioral techniques in a course such as this, but we'll be exposed to some of this. But baseline, which is, where are we starting? What's going on? And so you have a baseline, and then as time goes on, you see whether behaviors have improved. Hopefully, if you're not reducing behaviors, you're increasing the alternate behavior, the incompatible behavior, so to speak, and you can kind of see progress by comparing what's going on now with the baseline, what was going on before changes were implemented, that kind of thing. It tends to be focused more upon overt behaviors, but there are instruments that can be used to measure less concrete things. For instance, um, self-esteem and depression and attitudes about parenting and things like that. There are instruments out there that you can measure how a client feels about certain things, and kind of look over time as to whether or not those issues improve because of your interventions. There are also, qualitative measurements. Maybe there are certain things that happen, critical incidents. Where a client, you know, maybe has a disagreement with the spouse, but is able to walk away from the spouse and to find a positive way to reduce his anger, and so he doesn't lash out against the spouse. That's just one example off the top of my head, but those critical incidents is another way to. It isn't so much a quantity as it is a quality kind of a thing that that you can reinforce for the client that they're actually finding new ways of responding to old problems. Here's an example of a self-anchored scale. So if your goal is to reduce anxiety in certain situations or generalized anxiety, probably the more specific again you can get in identifying things, the better. This is just a simple thing, where how are you feeling today? Well, I'm a 4 today. I'm moderately anxious, and so but yesterday it was a 7 because et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you could establish self-anchored scales just by having a conversation with your client, and on a 1 to 10 scale, one being you're sitting by a mountain stream listening to the babbling brook, and the sun is shining and there's a gentle breeze, and you have somebody you really love next to you, and you know and a 10 is you're well, think of the worst thing the worst situation you could ever be in. Can you identify that? And the client says, yeah, well, X, Y, and Z. My fingernails are being pulled out, and by somebody, and they say, okay, make that a 9, and ten's even worse than that. You can't even imagine. That's just a way to kind of develop a self-anchored scale off the top, and it can be an effective way of measuring all sorts of different kinds of things, not just anxiety, but how depressed an individual feels or anything like that. There are some other methods to scale goal achievement, and again, these get into more specific things that have to do with behavioral interventions and things that I just don't want to get too deeply into this semester. But different kinds of scales and um, that you can use the subjective units of distress that measures the intensity of unpleasant feelings or sensations on a scale of 1 to 10. And again, I think that's very much like a self-anchored scale. Um, so there are some packages out there that that you can utilize to measure change and progress on different kinds of things that's like distress and anxiety, as I was saying. But if you're working for an agency, it would be wise for you to make sure that your agency's willing to have you use them as well. Because sometimes there are policies and practices that, for whatever reason, make them reluctant for you to use them. And it's not always that they're good policies and practices, but here's some guidelines for obtaining baseline measures that are some just something for you to reflect on, I suppose. When you're writing the contract, and this is one of the things that well, there's all sorts of different kinds of contracts, like I said, and here this even talks about oral contracts. And I was told one time that, and I believe there's some truth to this, that there is a value in having a client sign a document that says I agree to do X, Y, and Z. For one thing, you'll find, particularly with clients that are less than voluntary, uh, their memories of what they agreed to will be different from what your memory is. And even if you've got it documented, in your case notes or whatever, right after the meeting or during the meeting, even, they'll tell you, that's not what I agreed to. This is what I said. And so it's a good thing. And it could be an honest, honest confusion, and could be you're wrong. I don't know, but in any event, it's useful to write these things down and to have the client sign them. And there are those who say, again, this is authority stuff. There are those who say that when somebody signs their name to something, it has more meaning to them. That may or may not be true, a certain kind of level that makes sense, I suppose. I can hear Eileen Gambrell screaming at me for saying that. She may change me forever. I don't know. I may never be certain of anything anymore, and I have enough problem with that to begin with. That's what makes me a good social worker. I think is there's so many gray areas all around me. But the elements of these contracts or whatever, the goals, our roles, what kind of techniques or interventions are being employed, our time frames, how often are we getting together, how often are we looking at things, how are we going to monitor progress, if we have to renegotiate, what are the stipulations to that? What might cause us to look at renegotiating, or is there a certain time period where we'll look at? And this is the thing for a lot of times for behavior contracts. That makes it more attractive to individuals is the time limit. That so that let's do this for 4 weeks, and at that time we'll sit down and we'll see how this is going. If we want to continue this contract, do we want a new one then, or do we just want to stop altogether? Whatever, those kinds of things. All these kinds of things are good thing for when you're trying to work out a contract. Also, this is something in parenting class that here is that simple well, this is a sample. I say simple. This kind of thing sometimes that we would have parents write up with their teenagers when they had a problem behavior. Teenagers wanted something, or parents are trying to motivate them to change, and they'd agree. They'd write out a contract basically, and get rewards if they achieve their goals and those kinds of things. But you see here, this is very simple. um, what do I agree to do? What do I get if I do this? If there are things that maybe can motivate me to do it even more quickly. What happens if I don't do it? How are we going to tell whether it's being accomplished or not? Very simple agreement. In in the world of OCS, at least is how it was 3 or 4 years ago. So much of the focus is upon kids in foster care, and more and more and more as time went on, my supervisory focus was upon, well, at one time it was called intake, then it was called investigations, then it was initial assessment. It may have a different name now, I don't know, but the idea was, we were out there looking at the initial complaints and trying to put services in place to keep kids in the home, assessing for, obviously for potential for risk for harm and those kinds of things, looking for danger. Um, but we did not write case plans, and case planning would became a function of the other unit, which was the family services unit. And we were not even to at one point we were supposed to start the case plans, and what family services people often did with it was just to start all over again with a new case plan when they got them, because they wanted to work on other things. Sometimes there wasn't the kind of coordination that needed to be done. So anyway, the decision was made that the intakes or investigation section IA was going to focus upon, the investigation and not get so much into case planning or not get into it. And sort of the hidden message, the subtext to that was that meant less working with families and more just kind of like policing, and most of us didn't like that. And so one of the things we were trying to do was at least to make it clear to people whether they were moving on or not, these are the kinds of things you're going to agree to, and this is what we want you to do, so that we don't need to come back, and you can make the changes you need to make. And we started implementing that, and we got in a little bit of trouble with the higher ups because it wasn't an official form or something, I don't know. But this is, I think it's a good, simple is good, and I like this. But as I said, I think I'm going to have a copy of the kind of format that OCS uses for their case plans these days, and you're going to see it's a little bit more complicated than this. So anyway, we are responsible for evaluating progress toward problem resolution and goal achievement. And not only for the client's progress, but also it's a sort of an opportunity for you, for the worker, to be able to evaluate whether or not what we're doing is making a difference, because that gives us feedback as to whether or not we need to change our approach. We need to look for new ways, what worked, what didn't. It tells us something about what to try again in the future. And if it didn't work, we're going to have to assess why. And it may be about the individual client. It could be about the circumstances the client is in. It could be that your method wasn't one that was supported by research and, those kinds of things. And this evaluation is not only good for the client, but it's good for you as well. Um, and this final point here, and I hate to end this on on such a negative note, but the fact is that if we don't evaluate our progress, this could be considered professional negligence and even malpractice, and get us into some legal or professional issues, professional troubles. There's a lot of discussion about malpractice in these textbooks, and I have to say that in all the years I was in the field, there are very few times that I've ever was aware of anybody that I was personally associated with that had any kind of lawsuit about malpractice. I don't want to scare you away from the field with these kinds of things, but these are things that we need to be informed about, and so that we don't get into those situations. But it's we do have a litigious society. Litigious, I guess, is the term, society, and you know. Um, we just need to know what we need to do to make sure that we can demonstrate that what we're doing is quality. So okay, so that's my summary of contracting, and there's going to be more discussion about these particular items as the semester goes along. But I hope this had uh, some usefulness to you. And again, we'll get into the phase before this in a few more weeks. There's also, a few chapters that are out of Gambrel that relate to this particular topic, and I'm not talking about them here. There's going to be a separate discussion of them. So, okay, let me know if there's any questions you have about any of this. Otherwise, I'll be talking with you again soon. Bye for now.